What's going on, guys? It's your boy back with another video, and today we're saying Mr. Bro 150 times. Here we go. Mr. Bro, 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 Mr. Bro. Now let's see how much that was. That definitely wasn't 150, but we just need to count. And 1, 2, 3, I don't know. How many times was that? We're just gonna say as much as I can when I'm just gonna stop. Okay? Mr. Bro, 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 Bro, Mr. Bro, Mr. Bro, Mr. Bro, Bro. Jeez. Stop it. Oh my gosh, whatever. Mr. Bro 6,000. Whoa. Mr. Bro, 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 Mr. Bro. We're probably not gonna be able to say this 500 times, but Mr. Bro, 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 Mr. Bro. Okay, we're just gonna play around with all these ones I've made. Mr. Bro, Mr. Bro. Mr. Bro, 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 Mr. Bro. Please subscribe to Mr. Bro. Mr. Bro, Mr. Bro, come on, guys. I just need Mr. Bro some more subscribers. Mr. Bro, Mr. Bro, Mr. Bro, Mr. Bro. Let me just have a talk with myself. This is all for the views, Thomas. This is all for the likes. This is all for the... Oh, never mind. Mr. Bro, 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 jeez. Mr. Bro, Mr. Bro, Mr. Bro. If you guys want me to do something like this again, click that like button and Mr. Bro subscribe to Mr. Bro in the description, Mr. Bro. The video's not over. We're not going to count all these ones up, just when I feel like we've done it. What the heck happened? Whatever. Mr. Bro. Dude, if Mr. Bro sees this video, he's going to be so proud of me, Mr. Bro. Like, so Mr. Bro. Proud of Mr. Bro. Mr. Bro, Mr. Bro. Mr. Bro. Mr. Bro. Mr. Bro. Mr. Bro. This isn't going to be like an hour because I'm only saying it as 500 times, 150. Mr. Bro. Mr. Bro. Mr. Bro. Mr. Bro. Mr. Bro. Mr. Bro. Mr. I'm going to go crazy after this. Mr. Bro. Mr. Bro. Mr. Bro. It's only been 4 minutes. Mr. Bro. Mr. Bro. I'd be so upset if this was lost. My mic is recording though. I see it. Mr. Bro. And it's plugged in. Mr. Bro. Mr. Bro, Mr. Bro, Mr. Bro, Mr. Bro, Mr. Bro, Mr. Bro, Mr. Bro. What were we saying again? I forgot Mr. Bro, Mr. Bro, Mr. Bro, Mr. Bro, Mr. Bro, Mr. Bro's the best. Mr. Bro, Mr. Bro, sub to Mr. Bro in the description. Mr. Bro, Mr. Bro, sub to RCB in the description. Mr. Bro, also Mr. Beast, Mr. Bro, and also Mr. Bro, Mr. Bro, Mr. Bro, Mr. Bro. Mr. Bro 6, Mr. Bro, Mr. Bro, Mr. Bro, Mr. Bro, Mr. We definitely have more than 100, but we're going for 500, boys. Mr. Bro, 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 Mr. Bro. Mr. Bro, 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 Mr. Bro. Jeez. Anyways, let's go. Mr. Bro. Mr. Bro 6,000. Oh, Mr. Bro, Mr. Bro, Mr. Bro. Change it once or twice, but I think it's here this night. Mr. B 6,000. Oh, Mr. Bro, Mr. Bro, Mr. Bro, Mr. Bro, Mr. Bro, Mr. Bro, Mr. My parents are having a good time watching football. Well, I'm just here saying Mr. Bro. What is my life? It's all for views, guys. So, yeah, like, Mr. Bro. Mr. Frickin' Bro. Mr. 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 Bro. I'm getting lightheaded. Oh my god. Mr. Bro. 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 Sub to who? 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 Mr. Bro. Mr. Bro. Mr. Bro. Mr. Bro. Mr. Bro. Mr. Bro. Like this video, Mr. Bro. Please, if you're watching this, Mr. Bro, please like this video and subscribe. Mr. Bro. Mr. Bro. Mr. Bro likes trains. Mr. Bro. Mr. Bro. Mr. I'm gonna make Mr. Bro a new outro. Mr. Bro. Mr. Bro. Who's the greatest of all time? Mr. Bro. Is he better than his brother? Mr. Bro. Maybe his. Mr. Bro. Well, maybe not. Mr. Bro. Boom. That's the outro. And then there's gonna be an explosion at the end. And subscriber, I'm gonna delete your Minecraft account. Boom. Mr. Bro, if you wanna use that, just let me know. Mr. Bro. Mr. Bro 6,000. Oh, Mr. Bro, Mr. Bro, Mr. Bro. I should really just be saying Mr. Bro instead of saying all these extra words. Whatever, Mr. Bro. Mr. Bro, Mr. Bro, Mr. Bro, Mr. Bro. Gucci gang, Gucci gang, Gucci gang. Mr. Bro, Mr. Bro, Mr. Bro. Mr. Bro, Mr. Bro, Mr. Bro. Mr. Bro, Mr. Bro, Mr. Bro, Mr. Bro, Mr. Bro, Mr. Bro, Mr. Bro. Mr. Bro. Ah, jeez. Mr. Bro. What? Mr. Bro. 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 Mr. Bro, 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 Mr. Bro. You guys better like this video for Mr. Bro. Subscribe to Mr. Bro, Mr. Beast, RTB, all in the description. Mr. Bro, Mr. Bro. Mr. Bro, I'm gonna get sick after this. I'm lightheaded. Mr. Bro. It's for the views, though, Mr. Bro. For the views, the meme, Mr. Bro. 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 I'm gonna sleep. Mr. Bro. Mr. Bro. Mr. Bro. Mr. Bro. And I'm doing this video late at night, so Mr. Bro. Mr. Bro. Mr. Frickin' Bro. Mr. Bro. I'd really be upset if this video is like copyrighted, striked. I don't know. It probably won't. But like Mr. Bro. Also, if it gets like corrupt or something, I'd be Mr. Bro really Mr. Bro mad. Mr. Bro, what is my life come to? I need more video ideas. Let me know in the comments. More video ideas, Mr. Bro. 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 Mr. Bro, 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 5 hours later, Mr. Bro, Mr. Bro, Mr. Bro, Mr. Bro, Mr. Bro, Mr. Bro, Mr. Bro. I need makeup for all the ones I just typed. Mr. Bro, Mr. Bro, Mr. Bro, Mr. Bro, Mr. Okay, I guess it. Mr. Bro. Mr. Bro, subscribe to Mr. Bro. I'm done. Mr. Bro, see you later, cuts. We outie. Bye.
And on we'll go, through the wastelands, through the highways, till my shadow turns to sun rays. And on